Well, today I am delighted to be able to host Professor Aaron Koller on behalf of the Alan Leve Center for Jewish Studies at UCLA. I'd like to welcome you to this event that highlights Professor Koller's most recent work. His book is available through the Jewish Publication Society and where, of course, ever books are sold, like Amazon or there used to be stores, but you can go and get this book. And this is a really cool book. I like physical books, and this is one of those great books to sit down in the evening and read. So really encourage you to get yourself a physical copy of this one. I also want to remind you that this event is part of the Bible and Ancient World series that is co-sponsored by the UCLA Center for the Study of Religion, and the UCLA Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, in which I'm a member. I'm also on the steering committee for the Center for Jewish Studies, which is also part of this, the Alan D. Leve Center, which is the main sponsor. So thank you all for being socially distanced. So the good and the bad part of this is we don't have to wear our masks today, all right? So today we have the unmasking of on Zoom, and we have the unbinding of Isaac. Our speaker today is Professor Aaron Koller, who is a professor of Near Eastern Studies at Yeshiva University. Your bio, Professor Koller, says that you study Semitic languages, which I think is true, but seems like an unnecessarily narrow description of your work. Of course, you're the author of this recent book, Unbinding Isaac, The Significance of the Akedah for Modern Jewish Thought, which was published by JPS in 2020, but also recently the Esther in Ancient Jewish Thought, published by Cambridge University Press in 2014. There are a number of other books that you've written and edited. You've been a fellow at the Albright Institute of the Albright Institute for Archaeological Research, the Hartman Institute. It's interesting. One of the things I think of you, or began knowing you first for, was your book, The Ancient Semitic Field of Cutting Tools, which probably describes your affiliation that we started with. And of course, you wrote what I think is the seminal article on the early alphabet. There's an article that Professor Koller published in 2018, The Alphabet in the Second Millennium BC. So you're stretching the entire history of Jewish thought from the beginnings of writing until the modern reception of the Akedah. And we're really, really fortunate to have you with us here today. And so I'm delighted to turn this over to Professor Koller.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Professor Schniedewind. It's really an honor to be here. Yeah, you're right about the Semitic languages. I actually wish I just studied Semitic languages. I think that would make things a bit easier. But I think you and I have in common, and this is not all that common in the North American Academy, being interested both in biblical literature and the history of ideas, and also languages and linguistics and philology. So it's one of the reasons I've always really enjoyed and learned from your work. And so it's a particular honor to be here with you today. I suppose with that, I will jump in if it's okay. I'm gonna share my screen and put up this this PowerPoint and jump into this. So as you said, Professor Schniedewind, the topic, the excuse for my invitation, which is such an honor, is this somewhat recent book. It was published in 2020, but it was published a few months after the pandemic started. So it was like an interesting experience of publishing a book in a pandemic. It's sort of like chopping down a tree in a forest where no one's around to hear it. It's like it landed probably, but you would never know because no one's paying attention to react. So it's been a sort of slow motion rollout of the book, and it's really a pleasure to be able to speak about it with you today. So I'm going to frame it as follows. The work on this project actually started in earnest probably about 15, 16 years ago, not too long after September 11th, where there were, of course, a lot of different kinds of reactions to September 11th in my own head. I was living in New York at the time. I was in school at Philadelphia. So there was a lot of ways of reacting. But one of the reactions was like, wow, religious violence is really a terrifying thing. And as someone who studies religion, and mostly ancient religion, there's a long history to this problem, and there are many facets to this problem. As someone who is invested in Jewish thought and the Jewish community, I was particularly sort of anxious about what Jewish sources would have to say about religious violence and how a religion could be full of faith and devotion and yet not shade into the problem of being so devoted that violence could result. Religious violence, I don't have to go through a history, and I wouldn't have time to do it anyway, but it has a long, bloody history. And of course, this is true on all sides. It has been argued, I think you probably know this as well as I do, it has been argued, especially by the Egyptologist Jan Assmann, that monotheistic religions have a special problem of violence because they are by nature intolerant. And that's not necessarily a judgmental thing to say, just a descriptive thing to say. Whereas a polytheistic religion can, in principle, tolerate lots of other faiths without seeing them as threatening. So within the large, great monotheistic faiths, of course, we unfortunately have bloody histories of religious violence on the Christian side and on the Muslim side. Jews have not usually been the perpetrators, but very unfortunately, in modern times, religious violence has certainly become an equal opportunity problem, and it's in fact a growing problem around the world. As I said, these are scenes from just the news in our own lifetimes, things that we've become accustomed to. Various religious faiths leading believers to do things in the name of religion. And of course, there will be co-religionists who will say, that's not my religion. But some people in the name of religion will do pretty horrifically violent things. This is, you may recall, the aftermath of the 1994 massacre in Hebron by the American Jewish moved to Israel Dr. Baruch Goldstein, who opened fire and killed 29 people in a mosque there. So one of the paths that this led me down was back to the biblical story of the binding of Isaac, which I know is a very familiar story, but the sort of thumbnail sketch of it is that God, after a fairly long relationship with Abraham already, appears to Abraham and tells him to go bring his son Isaac as a sacrifice on an altar on a mountain somewhat far away, which Abraham then proceeds to do. At the very last minute, God, an angel, steps in and intervenes, stopping the actual sacrifice from taking place. But Abraham is given a reward for being willing to offer his son, for not withholding his son from God when the son was asked. Now, that's the short version of the story. It's not a very long story in any telling of it. It's 19 verses in Genesis 22. The Bible, as is its wont, is remarkably short on details. It's just the way stories are told. So it leaves a lot unsaid. But one particularly powerful interpretation, reading of the story, was offered about 200 years ago, almost 200 years ago now, by the Danish religious philosopher, Søren Kierkegaard, who argued, and I'm not going to do him justice here. I actually spend a lot of time on him in the book because sort of excavating his biography and his thought just became thrilling to me to see where he was coming from in his reading. But just a really short version of it is that he sees the story of the binding of Isaac as a story of the clash between universal ethics on the one hand, the sort of self-evident propositions that one ought not to kill an innocent person, one ought not to kill one's child, not to harm one's child. Those are obvious ethical norms, and those stand on one side of Abraham's ledger. And on the other hand, we have the call of faith, this inscrutable and personal call of faith that only Abraham experiences, and therefore only Abraham can understand. And so Kierkegaard sees the story as a story that poses the question, can faith legitimately demand that someone put ethics aside and do something non-ethical for the sake of that personal, private faith? And Kierkegaard writes his book. It's a fascinating and amazing book called Fear and Trembling, in English called Fear and Trembling. He writes it under a pseudonym, so he doesn't argue anything in particular, but he sort of concludes the book by saying, well, either we agree that faith can demand the suspension of ethics, or we have to condemn Abraham as a murderer. Those are our choices. As readers of the story, we either have to follow him and say that faith can suspend ethics, or we have to simply say Abraham was wrong, faith can't do that, faith oughtn't do that, and therefore Abraham is a violent murderer. So to my mind, Kierkegaard makes this story even harder to swallow, because Kierkegaard says that's what this whole story is about. The story says, if it troubles you that sometimes people do really terrible, unethical things in the name of religion, that's fine. That's actually the whole point of the story of the binding of Isaac. And again, I'm not really doing justice to the nuance that Kierkegaard introduces into it, but I think I'm not being unfair to him either. And so that the story has been read by many people in the last couple of centuries as a story about the triumph of ideology over humanity, of religious devotion over ethics. And this is, I came across this later. Well, I re-came across it later. It's a line sort of stuck in the middle of Carol Gilligan's classic book in a different voice, where she says, look, the blind willingness to sacrifice people to truth has always been the danger of an ethics abstracted from life. And her two examples of this are Gandhi and the biblical Abraham, who, she says, prepared to sacrifice the life of his son in order to demonstrate the integrity and supremacy of his faith. So this is just a very common, almost pervasive way of reading the story in modern times, as a story that asks us to think, what happens when faith confronts ethics? And according to this reading, the story says, the answer is that faith wins even against ethics, even at the cost of violence, even at the cost of someone else's life. So this really, struck me as deeply troubling. And one of the things that I went looking for was first the history of, were people troubled by the story of the binding of Isaac before, let's say, the 20th century? And did this sit well with people until modern times, or was this always a troubling story? And second, is there another way of reading it? And as if people were not troubled by it, is that because they were actually maybe reading it differently? So I actually should say that Gilligan, I wound up with Gilligan's quote. One thing I hadn't realized when I wrote the book was actually the potential for turning a gender lens on the story and using that to, I think, bring out some of the elements of the story that are otherwise not developed. I hadn't really realized that when I wrote the book. I sort of gestured towards it, but didn't really develop it. But I did work on it more recently, and hopefully there'll be an article sort of coming out as sort of a sequel where I take some of those ideas and play with them a little bit more, and use some of Gilligan's theory and some other feminist approaches to relationships and to biblical literature to tease some of those possibilities out with an ethical eye. But I'll leave that aside for today. I don't really have time to get into it. But again, so the first point was, were readers troubled by this? So some of the evidence, I think the short answer is that yes, there are lots of readers who were troubled by the story, and I'll show you some of that in the coming minutes. But some of this comes from not literary interpretations, but artistic interpretations. This is one of the most famous and arresting pictures of the binding of Isaac by Caravaggio. Caravaggio painted apparently 2 scenes of the binding of Isaac, which he and many other Christians for more than a millennium called typically the sacrifice of Isaac. Jews called it the binding of Isaac, where Christians call it the sacrifice of Isaac. That's changed in recent decades, but the other one by Caravaggio is in the Princeton Art Gallery, but this one in the Uffizi is, first of all, it is visually stunning, and I don't think Caravaggio needs my praise for his artistic ability. But there's a detail that some critics have drawn attention to. When you look at the scene, there's a lot that one could dwell on. There's the ram that will eventually serve as the actual sacrifice. There's the angel. There's Abraham, whose forehead is so furrowed, clearly not at ease or at peace with what's going on, although what exactly is troubling him, of course, isn't said. There's the landscape, but there's also, right at the bottom, towards the middle of the portrait, the eye of Isaac. And that eye of Isaac is the only thing in this painting that's actually directed at the viewer. This eye of Isaac is looking directly at us, only his right eye. His left eye is somewhat obscured. It's hard to tell what exactly it's doing, but the right eye is looking directly at us. It's hard to know whether he is screaming or gasping for air or just stunned, but I think it is clear that he's looking at us and that this eye asks us to pay attention to him. So I think it's fair to say that what Caravaggio is doing here is making sure that we don't only notice the religious drama, the spiritual turmoil of Abraham, but that we also don't cease to pay attention to the fact that Isaac is actually about to die. And that's something that all ethical problems with this story begin when we take our eye off of Isaac. When we think of this as the story of Abraham, then we have some serious ethical issues. Caravaggio says, look, it is a story about Abraham, but look here, Isaac is actually looking directly at you, and Isaac's asking you to look at him. If you pay attention to Isaac, then we're in a different ethical ballgame. Now we're in a different field. Now we have to think about, okay, well, Abraham has his faith, but what about Isaac's life? He's the innocent victim here. How do we grapple with that? And I think Caravaggio is doing this very intentionally, because once we're drawn to Isaac, then our whole field of reference, the whole frame of reference has to change. Now, lots of poets have dwelled on some of the problematics of the story. I'm not going to read these in total, but Wilfred Owen, the great poet, British poet of World War I, retells the story in a really beautiful poem. But at the end, when he gets to the second half of the story, when the angel calls to Abraham and tells him to stop sacrificing Isaac, Owen's version diverges from the biblical text. And I'll pick up here. When lo, an angel called him out of heaven, saying, lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do anything to him. Behold, a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Offer the ram of pride instead of him. But the old man would not do so, but slew his son, and half the seed of Europe, one by one. And Owen is one of the first, but also one of the most poignant poets to draw attention to the fact that the binding of Isaac actually can stand in for the way modern warfare works in general. You have the people of the older generation sitting back in the capital cities in London or in Vienna or wherever they may be, deciding whether or not kids who are 19 years old should stay in the trenches and shoot at other kids who are 19 years old. And Owen says, well, this is kind of the story of the binding of Isaac. You have the old man Abraham, who, sure, he has his revelation, and sure, God speaks to him. I'm not questioning it. It is what it is. But the fact is that he's going to make a decision not about his own life, but about the life of the kid Isaac. And oughtn't that trouble us? Shouldn't we just stop and say, wait a second, you know what? If a person of faith wants to sacrifice their own life, okay, I don't know what to say about it, but that's plausibly between themselves and their God. But if a person of faith says, because of my faith, that other person has to die, Owen says, well, that's not okay. And, it's made especially poignant because Owen actually did die in the trenches in France in World War I. So we have his poetry, but he never made it out alive. So he actually, obviously, when he wrote this, he couldn't have known it, but he was the Isaac in the story, and he paid that price for someone else's decision. Poets like Leonard Cohen have seen the binding of Isaac as a metaphor for warfare. you who build these altars now to sacrifice these children, you must not do it anymore. A scheme is not a vision, and you've never been tempted by a demon or a god. And this is true in modern Israel as well, where there is a whole series of poetry taking the binding of Isaac as a text for reflection, and using it to reflect on the dynamic of the parents who send their children off to war. Even if they're convinced it's for good reason, it may still be something that they think is unconscionable because of the imbalance of who's deciding and who's actually paying the price. So the poet Raya Harnick wrote a poem called Ani lo akriv, I won't sacrifice, where she says, look, I'm no less faithful than Abraham. At night, God and I make reckonings. Who can claim what? I know and I am grateful, but not my son, not for sacrifice. Just there are limits to what I'm willing to give up for God, even if I, as she says she does, deeply believes in God and that relationship. Again, this poem has a tragic ending or aftermath, because this poem was published in a collection called For Guni. Guni was her son, who in fact was killed in the 1982 invasion of Lebanon. So as much as she says she won't sacrifice her son, she did. And that's part of the tragic background to reading a poem like this, is that it's not divorced from real life. Now, that's in modern times. I'm going to spend just 2 minutes on the following point. One of the things that I found the most fascinating was that criticism of Abraham in terms like this is not a recent phenomenon. This is a poem from about 1,500 years ago, from the great Jewish poet Elazar Rabbi Kiliri, who wrote liturgical poems for use in the synagogue. And in one of his poems for the holiday of Shavuot, there's a really great context for this. He's telling a story about the Torah and God to try to explain why the Torah was not gifted to humankind all the way until the time of Moses. So in order to do that, the poem sort of reviews human history until the time of Moses and explains why no one was meritorious enough to receive the Torah. When it gets to Abraham, God says to the Torah, look, Torah, here's a wonderful person, Abraham, you should go to him. And the Torah says, I can't go to him. Look at this guy. You gave him a kid, the young man with whom you graced him when his strength was spent. He bound on the wood of the altar. I'm going to skip those 2 lines. And then he became great. His reputation spread throughout the land, but he forgot how a father is supposed to have mercy on a son. A prayer or plea he should have offered. And there's something really insightful about this. Abraham is entirely silent throughout the story of Genesis 22, never protests, never offers a word of objection or opposition to the divine command. And this poet, 1,500 years ago, said, what kind of father is that? Maybe he's very pious. I'm not going to question his piety. That's between him and God. But he's not a good parent. He's not a good human being. The Torah can't go to someone who's so pious that he literally forgets the basic responsibility of a parent. So this is, I was actually thrilled when I found that, to just realize that it's not a modern phenomenon that we cynical people look at the biblical story and say, it's not sitting right. Like there's something wrong with this. How could Abraham do this? People 1,500 years ago, and therefore I assume, 1,800, 2,000, 2,200 years ago, like people read this story with a lot of ambivalence for as long as people were reading the story. I don't have time to read this in any detail, but it's not only Jewish poets. This is a Syriac poem of the 6th or 7th century. Sebastian Brock, the great scholar of Syriac literature, has published a series of poems that reflect on the binding of Isaac, which have this really amazing and innovative addition where they put objection into the mouth of Sarah. Sarah, who's totally absent from the story of Genesis 22, reappears in these Syriac poems, and Sarah objects to what Abraham is doing. Sometimes this is like an imagined objection, sometimes it's a literal objection. And she says, Abraham, what are you doing? Are you so pious that you would even sacrifice your son? I can't let you do this. And this then goes in different directions in the hands of different poets. But again, that ambivalence about whether Abraham is in fact doing right by being willing to sacrifice his son, something felt by deeply pious religious people, but people who are also human beings and therefore emotional and realize the significance of the human relationships from antiquity and on. So after realizing that there was so much ambivalence and discomfort with the story, I started working on what are alternative ways of reading the story? And some of these, again, I was sort of excited to find out, were proffered back in antiquity and then sometimes rediscovered in modern times. So I'm just going to do this one pretty quickly. One way of reading the story, which is not a solution to the ethical problem, but essentially reads it in a way that avoids the ethical problem, reads the story as actually much more dramatic than we sometimes appreciate. So in one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which goes by the very sexy name 4Q225, the story of the binding of Isaac is retold. And there's an additional section where the different groups of angels in heaven are seen to react in different ways to what's going on down below. So as Abraham unsheaths his knife and holds it to Isaac's neck, we got this line. The angels of mastima. These are the angel. Mastima is essentially Satan. So these are the evil angels who are arrayed against God's will. The angels of mastima were rejoicing and saying, "Now he is finished. For if Abraham withholds his son, he will be found to be false. And if not, he will be found faithful, but his son will die." Now, it's put in the mouth of these angels, but what the author of this text realizes is that the entire covenantal history of Genesis, which admittedly we're only up to chapter 22, but that seems to be the whole point of the book, hangs in the balance at the moment that knife is on Isaac's neck. Because it seems like there are only two ways for this story to proceed. Either Isaac will die, and then the covenant might be alive and well, but it's going to die with Abraham because there's no next generation. Or Abraham will get cold feet, say, "You know what, God, I can't do this," put the knife back in his sheath, and Isaac will be alive, but the covenant will be dead. Now, I once read a comment by a literary editor who said, good books lead you to believe that there's only possibility A and possibility B at the end, but then along comes possibility C to surprise you. And of course, that's what happens in this story also. We thought there were only two options, but along comes a third, a literal intervention of God at this point, a deus ex machina, and God steps in and says, "Abraham," calling it off, right? The angel steps in. But before we get to that sort of climax, what this text does is say, hold on, we as readers, let's pretend we've never heard the story before. Pretend we don't know how it's going to end. We ought to be paralyzed with fear and terror at this moment, because the covenantal story of Genesis seems to be about to come to a crashing end one way or another. One modern reader who picks this up was Elie Wiesel, and in an essay that was published in this book, Messengers of God, but you can actually find, at least you could a couple of weeks ago, I'm sure you still can, find on YouTube a recording of him delivering this as a lecture in New York back in the 80s. Wiesel develops an understanding of the story that I think is in tune with this insight of a Dead Sea Scroll, but goes in a step further. And what Wiesel does is say, you know what, Abraham knew more than we're giving him credit for. Because Abraham knew that in the previous chapter, that covenant had been reaffirmed by God. So although it seems like the covenantal history is teetering on the edge here, Abraham has more faith than that. Abraham is absolutely certain that God will not let this covenant die. He doesn't know how it's gonna be salvaged, but he knows that God will not let the covenant die. So Abraham says, "Okay, God, you ask me to sacrifice Isaac on the altar. I know," now he's not going to say this to God, but he knows that God can't allow that to happen. And so what Abraham engages in is a really high stakes game of theological chicken with Isaac's life. You remember chicken when, this is back from previous decades. I don't know if people do this anymore, but, typically teenage kids who just got their driver's license 6 months ago take cars that may or may not be theirs and drive them at each other at as high a speed as possible. And then whoever jumps out last or swerves the car last wins, right? And in the movies, at least, that's how they get the girl also. So that kind of chicken is what Abraham's going to play with God. God says, offer Isaac as a sacrifice. Abraham says, okay, I'm going to go ahead with it. I'm going to go through with it. You're testing me. I will test you. I know that you can't let this happen because you've put your covenant on the line with Isaac surviving and the covenant intact. So I'm just going to keep going. I'll walk up that mountain. What, God? You haven't said anything yet? Okay, I'll build the altar. Still nothing? I'll take out my knife. I'll bind him on the altar. And of course, it gets harder and harder to stay the course, but Abraham is sure that God will eventually call it off. And at the very last instant, God does. And so Abraham wins. So that's Wiesel's reading of the story. And why would Abraham do this? Wiesel says, well, because what Abraham does then is he can turn around to God and say, great, now you owe me one. You put me through that. You now owe me something. What does Abraham then ask for? Well, a Midrash from about the 5th century CE, a rabbinic interpretation, says Abraham at that point turns to God and says, listen, God, you put me through that hellish experience of the last 3 days where I was sure and yet always anxious about the question of whether I would have to sacrifice my child. Here's the deal, God. Now you owe me something. So I don't need anything. But when the children of Isaac are in trouble, I want you to remember the Akedah. I want you to remember what I just did, and you need to have mercy on them. You need to be loyal and faithful to them the way I was just loyal and faithful to you. So that's one reading of the Akedah, which I think has, again, roots back in Qumran, but takes us all the way to Elie Wiesel. That it's not an ethical story. It's something else entirely. The story that the interpretation I'm going to do is just a few minutes that I argue for in my book is something different. It actually says, look, I want this to be historically contextualized. We know something about the ancient world now. You know, we shouldn't read this story the way Kierkegaard did in early 19th century Copenhagen, where the Bible sort of lives in a vacuum. We now know a huge amount about the ancient Near East, about religious life, about practices and beliefs, and all sorts of elements of life that can potentially help us contextualize and illuminate biblical narratives. Now, there's nothing directly relevant to Genesis 22 in anything that we know of, but we actually know a huge amount about the practice of child sacrifice. And I think this has sort of permeated the popular consciousness as well. It's not a broad Near Eastern practice. It's not the case that lots of people sacrifice their children in the ancient Near East. What we basically have is evidence for Phoenicians in the Phoenician diaspora sacrificing their children. And this comes from a number of sites mostly in the central Mediterranean. I'm not going to go into all the archaeological details now, but the most important and the largest site is the site of Carthage, which has been excavated a couple of times. And a team led by Lawrence Steger, who was one of my dissertation advisors, unfortunately passed away too young a few years ago, excavated it back in the 70s. And they discovered a cemetery with approximately 20,000 interments of infants over the course of about 800 years. So, this is what part of the cemetery looks like. You see just, anywhere you look, there's dozens and dozens of these tombstones. Some of them, I hope you can see on the right side, have inscriptions. Not all or even most of them have inscriptions, but some of them do. They also have various icons and other things that are helpful for us in understanding the religious beliefs and practices of the people at Carthage. And then under the tombstones, you find things like this. So this is an 8th century pot, intact. And when it's opened up, you actually can find you see in the caption, the charred remains of a 1 to 2 month old human infant. So this is, I can't quite imagine the emotions of the archaeologists who found these over and over and over again. It's horrifying on the one hand, It's also fascinating, on the other hand, because we have hundreds and thousands of these things. And again, as I said, some of them have inscriptions. So many of them say that this is in fulfillment of a vow that the parents made to some god or goddess, or god and goddess, because we vowed what we vowed, and he heard their voice, or she heard his voice, or the details differ from inscription to inscription. But with lots of evidence that essentially parents were sacrificing infants as payment for vows. So we never know the full story. You have to imagine that there was some crisis in the family, maybe an illness, maybe something else. And the parents said, well, if we get out of this, if God, if the face of Baal, if Tinit helps us, then we will sacrifice our next child to the god or goddess. And so they did, and we have the remains of it. And I don't think there's any way to look at this or think about it without breaking down, thinking about that emotional experience. But it's crucially important for thinking about the background of a story like Genesis 22. Because what it means is that the idea of sacrificing a child to God in fulfillment of a vow is not unique in the ancient world. Again, I don't want to exaggerate how common it was, but it existed as a practice. And if we had more time, we could talk about when and where. Maybe we could talk about that afterwards, Professor Schniedewind. But it existed as a practice. And so it's actually probably anachronistic to see the major drama in the story as being the question of whether Abraham would be willing to sacrifice his child to God. Because that wouldn't make Abraham all that special in the scheme of things. We even have other stories in the Hebrew Bible of parents sacrificing their children for religious faith. We could tease out differences between them, but we have the terrible story of Jephthah, who sacrifices his daughter. We have the Moabite king Mesha, who sacrifices his son to save his city. And we have stories from classical literature. This is actually not all that unique in Genesis 22. So what is unique in Genesis 22 then? What's the point of the story? Well, here I found actually the most insightful reading to come not from someone who is a professional biblical interpreter, but from the 20th century philosopher, Lithuanian, French, Jewish philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, who here looks happy, but in most pictures looks dour, like that. And Levinas actually wrote about the binding of Isaac a couple of times. And he says, the story is really not about the command to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. The high point of the drama is the second command, where the angel comes and tells Abraham, don't offer Isaac as a sacrifice. And this is a passage from one of his essays published in English in a book called Proper Names, where he says, Abraham's attentiveness to the voice that led him back to the ethical order in forbidding him to perform a human sacrifice is the highest point in the drama. That he obeyed the first voice is astonishing. That he had sufficient distance with respect to that obedience to hear the second voice, that is essential. In other words, what Levinas is saying is, oh, child sacrifice? Nah, I've heard of that. That's not a big deal. If you told me Abraham offered his child, I'd be like, oh, okay, so he's like a good Phoenician. Not all that interesting. What's astonishing about Abraham in the story of Genesis 22 is that when the angel comes and says, actually, don't sacrifice your child, leading him back to the ethical order, Abraham attends to that equally. He says, okay, so then I won't do it. Now, Levinas has this, in a different essay, has this amazing line. To see a face is already to hear, you shall not kill. And I want to just dwell on this for 30 seconds. For Levinas, this is the beginning of all ethics. The beginning of all ethics is me realizing that actually the person across from me, which right now is you, Professor Schniedewind, the person across from me is no less complex and rich and deep and valuable as I am. We all know how rich and complicated we all are. We contain multitudes. But everyone else is simplistic, right? Everyone else is just a cardboard cutout of a person. Levinas says to see another human face and to absorb it, to realize that like that human face is actually not different from my human face. That means that that person is no less complicated and interesting and valuable than I am. That's the beginning of all ethics. At that point, suddenly I give up on any claims that I'm more important than anyone else. And from that point flows the what we take to be obvious, but actually profound teaching, you shall not kill. It's profound because why shouldn't I kill? Well, what it means is that my life is not more valuable than his life or her life. And so I have no right to take that life for my own purposes. Now, I would love to think that this opens the door to a slightly new interpretation of that scene in the binding of Isaac. What is the messenger of God that tells Abraham, don't kill? So I'd love to propose that the messenger of God is in fact Isaac's face. Levinas would say, when Abraham looks into Isaac's face, Abraham suddenly realizes, wait a second, I might be a pious person hearing the call of God, but Isaac is not inferior to me. There's no reason that my piety should mean the end of Isaac's life. And so Isaac's face brings Abraham back to the ethical order. Isaac's face is the one that tells him, you shall not kill. Now, just to conclude, lots of artists in the Renaissance and before and after, but especially in the 16th, 17th centuries, portrayed the binding of Isaac. Most of them chose to portray the moment that Isaac was saved. Abraham's there with his knife. This is Rubens. The angel comes in and saves Isaac. Rubens, this is Rembrandt on the right, Jan Levens on the left. These are obviously really closely similar, and that's not surprising. Levens and Rembrandt were close colleagues. But Levens painted another painting of the binding of Isaac, and that's this one, where he chooses to depict not the moment where Isaac is saved, but the aftermath of that, where Abraham and Isaac come together in what we can only imagine is the most heartfelt and yet anxious embrace of their lives, where they know that they were an inch away from the entire life, the entire world ending from that for them emotionally. They don't understand that they're looking up in fear and consternation and anxiety and maybe gratitude. But the most important thing is that they're brought together. Isaac is not just unbound, but reunited with his father emotionally and covenantally. And so it's that painting that I put on the cover of my book, Unbinding Isaac, because I think the high point of this story is in fact the moment that after Isaac is unbound and reunites with his father covenantally. Okay, I will end it there. Sorry for going a bit over time.
Well, it's such an incredibly rich topic, and thank you so much. That was really fantastic. There are so many questions. This is the fantastic thing why, I really recommend people buying this book. I mean, I've read this story a million times, like many pious readers will have, and just thought it was one of the most incredible pieces of literature. I've often thought, I work on scribes a lot, and I've often thought, like, this would be a great school text in ancient Israelite academy. And for a lot of different reasons, some of it has to do with the grammar and style. Some has to do with the topic, and how interesting it is. But this seems like the problem of this book too, is the topic is too rich, So how did you decide like what to talk about, what to leave out? Why Kierkegaard, for example, as one of the foci of the book? One of the things I was very interested in about the story were interbiblical and possibly Second Temple texts, which you seem to have mostly left out of the book in favor of later medieval to modern interpretations. But like, what was the process of deciding like, what do I talk about here in this book?
Yeah, no, that's a really great point, and I think you're right about the text. It's actually, maybe it's to some extent a function of how the brevity with which the story is told, but you sort of can't get away from it. People just keep coming back to it from all sorts of angles. I actually struggled a lot with this book. I said, I started working on this like really a very long time ago, just collecting things, teaching, speaking about it here and there, but had a really hard time actually writing the book, in part for exactly the sort of literary reasons that you just mentioned. It was hard to figure out how to conceptualize a book about it. There is a comprehensive intellectual history of how everyone has read this story is way beyond my capacity. but it would be fascinating. But what I actually wound up doing was trying to stick as closely as possible to sort of one question, one answer. And the question is, are we really stuck with Kierkegaard? Like Kierkegaard has, I think, really, to a large extent, framed the way that people have seen this story. This is not universal. I think there's different communities and different communities of readers in modern times, but in many reading communities, the story is sort of unreflectively seen in Kierkegaardian terms. Like it's like, oh, well, yeah, it's a story of the suspension of the ethical. Like that's the question. So I tried to keep it to like, well, is that really let's unpack that reading. As I said, I did go into Kierkegaard in the book because I think actually understanding where he comes from is really useful in taking him apart to something. I don't want to use the loaded term deconstructing because it's not a very highly theorized book. But just understanding what was on Kierkegaard's mind, I think, goes a long way to understanding why he read this story in a particular way, and why lots of other people actually just didn't read the story in the same way at all. They don't see that those questions there. But I basically kept it as like, well, here's Kierkegaard, here's what he did, here's why I think this is really problematic, and I have a couple of chapters that sort of air out why I think this is really a very difficult reading to swallow. Somewhat textually, also in terms of religious tradition, mostly Jewish, a little bit Christian as well, and then try to articulate an alternative reading. So what I tried to do in the last 5-10 minutes here takes a few chapters to sort of unfold in the book, but that's the nature of writing is try to document it all and make sure it's all all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. So the only concession I had, but having said that, one of the thrilling parts of working on it was just the sheer variety of approaches that people have taken to the story, and I just couldn't get myself to like actually not include that at all. So there's sort of two ways in which I included that. One is that along the way, I actually do try to include as many voices as possible who I think are sort of fellow travelers. So there are medieval thinkers who I think were sort of going in similar directions to the way I want to develop the story. So I try to build on them. It's actually Muslim and Jewish thinkers who saw it in terms of the stories retold in the Quran and with different interesting differences that like also open up some interesting interpretive possibilities. But then my big concession is I do have a first chapter in the book that is really different from the rest of the book. It's just sort of it's a roadmap to different ways in which Jewish readers have encountered this story. So, what are the big themes that Jewish readers have seen in the story over the past couple of millennia? And it's certainly not comprehensive, not trying to be comprehensive at all, trying instead to just sort of like the layout of like the different ways that people have read it, what they've seen in it. A story of martyrdom, a story of faith, the different things that are there. And I think even if a reader like is unchallenged by Kierkegaard or unconvinced by the reading that I've proposed, I think there's just such a wealth of prior interpretations that I tried to like distill in that first chapter that there'll probably be something that I'm like, oh, that's actually my favorite reading.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I liked about reading this book is that, in some ways, this kind of approach could have just been an anthology of what other scholars but that's not what I felt. What I felt like it's the way you've written it is that I'm part of this group of fellow travelers who are studying this incredible, difficult story and going in different directions for different reasons. I think that your focus on child sacrifice as being normative to some extent in antiquity does give a twist that I think a lot of readers like Kierkegaard would have done well to have realized. But of course, you can't really blame them for not realizing things that they wouldn't have necessarily been fully aware of.
Right.
The other thing that was really interesting, I mean, I've read the story so many times with students even, and one thing I didn't notice, and so I was really struck by, it was the kachna, that when God commands Abraham, take your son, he just doesn't use a straight imperative. He says kachna, he softens it. And I was like, that's really weird. Why would God command you and then kind of like, na is this, word that sort of softens it. And it makes me think of another part of this story that I don't know that bothers me, but it's part of the role of the divine in this story that bothers me. God asking Abraham to do this thing that seems so horrendous is that God himself, to me, disappears in the story because he tests Abraham, but then in verse 11, it's the angel of the Lord, right? Not God who stays Abraham's hand. Why? And I was noticing when I was reading the book that this issue of the angel of the Lord as opposed to God himself staying Abraham's hand isn't reflected upon as much as I thought it might be. So I thought, well, if you had any thoughts of those two aspects of, the role of God in the story that you might want to share with me, give me some further insight.
Oh yeah, that's a great observation. I mean, both of those are really great observations, and it's true. I think just in general, like it's such a tersely worded story. It seems tempting to think like every word, I don't think this is a religious statement. I think just if a story is written like that, like any poet, right? So if you only have X number of words to work with, you're going to choose your words well. So like words seem to be significant. So the na seems very enticing for our interpreters. I guess I'll leave that one aside for right now. But in terms of the angel, I guess two things to say. So one is, one of the thinkers who did think a lot about that was Maimonides, and I try to sort of bring him in late in the book. I think the story, like the Binding of Isaac, essentially everyone who's ever read the Bible has thoughts about the Binding of Isaac. It's impossible not to. I mean, you could recoil from it and close the book, or you could, say this is the most profound and sublime story I've ever read, or anything in between. But like everyone has thoughts about this story. So, one of the things I realized early on, in scholarship, sometimes you're like looking for here's my contribution, right? I realized early on, like, if I actually say something brand new about the Binding of Isaac, it's probably just nonsense, which is why no one said it before. Like smart people have been reading this story for, at least 2,000 years that we have recorded interpretations. There's really no reason to think that I'm going to say something that like no one's ever thought of. So I really was trying to, I think the fellow travelers is a good idiom here. Really trying to say, like, what? While it's true that people have been saying things, they're often scattered in a comment here or a work there. And let's try to articulate something more synthesized. So Maimonides does think a lot about this angel thing. And for him, that means that I'll say these words, but it's sort of hard to understand, like a higher level of revelation, a more profound understanding of God's will. So that takes its own unpacking. But I think actually the more interesting thing to say, and maybe more tragic thing to say, is that after the command to offer Isaac as a sacrifice, Abraham and God never converse again. That's it. Mm-hmm. So the story is, whether you like it or don't like it is one question, but I think just as literature, it's clearly tragic because all of Abraham's relationships are severed by the end of the story. So if you ask me, like the beginning of Genesis 22, who are the most important relationships in Abraham's life, I'd be like, oh, there's three really. I mean, he's already kicked out Ishmael, so can't go with him. So we have Sarah, his new son Isaac, and God. I mean, that's, I don't know, in some order, and it's hard to know which order, but like in some order. And by the end of Genesis 22, all three of those relationships are gone. He never speaks to any of those three characters again. Sarah is about to die in the next chapter. He and Isaac are never in the same place, never share a conversation, and Abraham and God never talk again. Right. So I actually think that's a more powerful observation than Maimonides' sort of theological interpretation, that it may well be that at this point, maybe Abraham really is pious, but Abraham is also not, Abraham and God are not on speaking terms. And of course, you can then take that in different directions, but just as an observation, it's really striking that those three relationships all come to a crashing end in this story.
Yeah, that's a great observation. Let me just end with one more question, and this is probably comes back to your theme a little bit more. I was really struck by lots of things in this book, and there's one passage that you quote from Moshe Habertal where you after quoting him you summarize saying ignoring Isaac in the story is monstrous, which I just loved in a way. It's part of your, in a sense, critique of Kierkegaard. And on the other hand, one could say, well, Kierkegaard was right in the sense that Isaac seems to disappear from the story himself,
Yeah.
right? I mean, he's, in some ways, in the first part of the story, he's central. Abraham is talking with him, they're walking together. But then after the moment of staying Abraham's hand, Isaac disappears. And you talk about this in the book too. And in some ways, Kierkegaard ignoring of Isaac is part of what the story does too, I guess, in Kierkegaard's sense. I think you're right, that
no, unfortunately, I think you're right also. Yeah.
is given to Isaac, and when you think about Isaac in the story, it changes the story and the reading quite a bit.
Right. No, I think that's exactly right, and I wish it weren't so. I mean, it's actually there's sort of a I guess interpreter's dilemma here. I'm not willing to ignore Isaac on all sorts of grounds, but as you say, the text ignores Isaac at the end. I mean, literarily, as far as we know, Isaac's still bound up on the altar. Like no one ever unties him. He never comes down. He's just sitting there, like screaming or like I don't know what he's doing.
What the hell is going on?
Right. If this were like a comedy sketch, and there are plenty of comedy sketches about the binding of Isaac, but if it were a comedy sketch, you can imagine him like at night, Abraham's long gone, celebrating the fact that Isaac's still alive, and Isaac's like, and the cameras go back to the altar, and he's like still still tied up there, like Dad. But it's terrible.
For years, right?
Right. No, but it is terrible. I actually think that actually troubles me a lot. Because then it's not just a question of interpreters missing Isaac. Like the text itself elides Isaac, and that really is troubling. And I don't have a good solution for it. I mean, I like you say, I mentioned it. I talk about some of the other things that people have said about the absence of Isaac in the end of the story. But I wish I had a more insightful solution to that problem.
In some ways,
I'll say that
I was reading the stories. I was thinking about the Akedah and the Job story because of the problem of ethics in
right.
that. And of course, a lot of that, I rationalize by saying it's a parable. It's not; these aren't things that are actually happening. It helps me to sort of think of this as a story that explores an ethical problem,
right?
As opposed to thinking about it.
Well, there were some. I mentioned this really quickly in the book because it would have been a bit of a side point. But there were some medieval thinkers, Jewish thinkers, who argued that the whole thing was a dream of Abraham's, and that if you had asked Isaac, what do you think about that binding, he would have been like, "I'm sorry, I have no idea what you're talking about," and then you might have been wise to not tell him because no need to traumatize him. Some people understand that that's Maimonides' view. It's not clear if that's Maimonides' view, but of course Maimonides explicitly says that he's not going to tell you his own views on a lot of things. So it's an open question whether he thought so. But some thinkers explicitly are very clear that they think that this whole thing was a dream, and I think they're getting to it from the same direction that you just said. Well, if the point of the story is to sort of play out a scenario that teaches a lesson, what do you have to traumatize actual people for? Like write a story that develops these ideas and tell me what the answer is, and then we're good, right? I mean, that's how fiction works. Mm-hmm. So some readers. This is actually a question that I've wondered about a lot, especially with students. There's like this bias against fiction in sacred writing. Students who have always assumed that the Bible was sacred have a really hard time thinking of it as anything other than historical fact. Mm-hmm. Even with a book like Job, where lots of readers for eternity have thought that it's just a parable. So how could that be? Is fiction really religiously significant? I think that's actually a really fascinating question. I don't know, can fiction be religiously significant? Like, why not? It does a lot of other things for us, but it is, I think, an interesting question and a significant question. It's obviously not the way most readers have approached this, but I'm not sure it's off the table, even for a sort of pious reader of the Bible, to say, like, well, like other parts of the story that we know were parables or literary works of genres other than history, is it possible that this one is as well?
Yeah. Well, on that, I just will end this, but I just wanted to reiterate, this was a fantastic read. This was a fantastic discussion, and I really encourage people to become fellow travelers in this story by reading your book. It's a great book. Thank you.
Thank you. If I could say one last thing, is that when I've had a chance to talk about the story, so it's a story that everyone has an opinion about, right? So I'll get up and give my talk about some aspect of it, and I don't get any questions about what I say. People are just like, well, here's how I read the story. So I actually love this. I think this is fantastic. I've learned from all those conversations, and I hope that if people listen to this talk, read the book, and say, forget what Koller said, but here's how I read the story. That is great. I would love to hear it, and I just hope people continue to engage and think about it.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.